The purpose of this module is to introduce mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness. I'll explain what mindfulness is, but also try to get beyond the simple definition to what you might call the spirit of mindfulness. Really, above all else, mindfulness is a practice. If you want to learn mindfulness, if you want to benefit from mindfulness, there's no substitute for time spent practicing it. Now, that said, in this course, we're not going to be spending that much time on mindfulness practice, or what you might call pure mindfulness practice at least. There are many good courses available in mindfulness, including some online options, and I've suggested one or two of these in the additional resources section for the module. But I don't want to suggest that this course is the equivalent of a mindfulness course. If you've done a mindfulness course, or you want to do one, then I think that's going to be helpful. At the same time, I don't think it's necessary, and I'm not going to assume anything about your experience with mindfulness. I'm introducing mindfulness as a tool, because I think it really adds something important to biofeedback practice. I think it works very well with biofeedback as a tool for working with your problems and achieving goals. So I can't say I'm teaching mindfulness in the traditional way, though I do consider that I'm respecting the spirit of mindfulness. As you may know, mindfulness first developed in the ancient Buddhist tradition. I should say straight away that you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice mindfulness, and I don't believe there's anything in this course that's going to conflict with any religious beliefs that you might have, or even anti-religious beliefs for that matter. So I'm going to be saying something about different aspects of mindfulness, what I call dimensions of mindfulness, or just dimensions of awareness. As I say, this is not really the traditional way of presenting mindfulness. And then I want to begin to show you how mindfulness is relevant to biofeedback practice, how mindfulness and biofeedback can mutually support each other. I first learnt mindfulness meditation well over 20 years ago now, and I've been practicing it most days ever since. It's true to say I always found it difficult, and in fact my interest in biofeedback developed as a way of supporting my mindfulness practice. Even now, I find that without biofeedback, most of my time is spent in daydreaming or other forms of distraction, but with biofeedback, I find I can be much more effective in keeping a relaxed and stable focus. The module is in 3 parts. In this part, we'll be looking at defining mindfulness, finding out what it actually is. Then in part 2, we'll build on that, going a little deeper into aspects of mindfulness, or what I'm calling dimensions of mindfulness. Lastly, we'll look at mindfulness and flow. Flow is the concept we introduced in Module 1, Part 2. It's not the same as mindfulness, but I think we'd all want our practice of mindfulness to have some of the qualities of flow. So we'll look at that. And that will be the context for introducing biofeedback. Like Module 1, this module is laying the foundations for the biofeedback work that's coming up in the next module. And again, I'll be making it as practical as I can. There'll be some mindfulness exercises, and there'll also be some pen and paper exercises like in Module 1, or at least some thought exercises. Mindfulness is active, deliberate awareness. It means paying attention, and paying attention in a particular way. It's paying attention in the present moment, or to the present moment. Much of the time, we're thinking about past or future. We're not really paying attention to the here and now, so we're not actually being mindful. Mindfulness means paying attention with openness and kindness. Mindfulness is non-reactive. So that means we're just taking in whatever is there to be aware of, whatever is happening, without either pushing away or rejecting what we don't like, or grasping after what we do like, but just with an attitude that is gently appreciative, both of ourselves and the world around us. So that's it. That's what mindfulness is. You can practice it in just about any context of life, such as doing the washing up, although in some contexts it's inherently more difficult to be mindful than others. That's not to say that you have to be mindful all the time. I personally don't believe that. I think daydreaming can actually be quite good for you at times. And you can practice mindfulness more formally in a context of formal meditation, where you're essentially not doing anything else but being aware, focusing on the present moment. So it's sort of easy enough to say what mindfulness is, even quite succinctly, but it's also quite easy to miss the point, especially before you've actually practiced it. There's a lot more that could be said. This bare definition doesn't necessarily convey the spirit of mindfulness. As I said earlier, mindfulness first developed in the Buddhist traditions of ancient India, and the Buddhist scriptures give us a number of metaphors for mindfulness, which I think give us a sense of that spirit. So here's one. Being mindful is like walking with a bowl filled to the brim with oil balanced on your head. Moving with smoothness, grace and precision, not a drop is spilt. So this metaphor emphasizes the balancing influence of mindfulness. Another one. Mindfulness practice is like climbing a tower, enabling you to see a long way. With mindfulness we gain perspective, clear-sightedness and perhaps detachment. Mindfulness is like a strong post to which a wild animal is chained. The wild animal is the unruly mind. This metaphor emphasizes the stabilizing influence of mindfulness. There's a variation of this one from the Tibetan tradition that I think is really useful. This story says that it's best to tether a wild horse with a long rope. Then the animal still has some freedom, plenty of space to move about in, so it doesn't feel quite so constrained. As it gets used to captivity, the rope can be shortened. I think this image says something about the need for balanced effort, not being too willful or over-controlling, but at the same time still applying the mind, not being too lax. Mindfulness is not the same as daydreaming. Mindfulness is a form of mind training. It evolved in Buddhism as a tool for training the mind, for transforming the mind. And as such, it aims to develop certain qualities of mind. So what qualities of mind? Well, in a sense, this is up to you. There are numerous positive qualities of mind, and you can focus on whatever is most appealing to you. But traditionally, it's things such as stillness and calmness, the opposite of the kind of busy racing mind that's so common in today's world. And related to that, clarity, also focus, a focus that is stable and malleable. Peace, contentment, and emotional positivity. For example, we want the mind to be loving and appreciative. Also energy and vitality. Well, that's all very well. I'm sure we'd all sign up for those qualities. But when it comes to the actual practice of mindfulness, what do we do to bring about those qualities? Well, I mentioned that mindfulness meditation is the formal practice of mindfulness, usually in the context of sitting with nothing else to do but be aware. You can pick an object of focus, so traditionally it's the breath, and that's the practice of mindfulness of breathing. So what you do is simply maintain the focus on the breath. You remain continuously aware of the breath, at least as much as you can. When the mind wanders, and it will, then you simply bring it back to the focus on the breath. That's it. That's essentially all the instruction. There are details such as counting the breaths, but it's not really an exercise in counting, it's an exercise in paying attention, in bringing the attention back to the breath. So no real reference to the qualities that you're trying to develop, such as clarity and stillness. In a way, they're almost incidental. You might or you might not experience clarity and stillness, but just keep doing the same thing regardless. So at first sight, this seems to be something of a paradox. At the heart of mindfulness is a sort of paradoxical mindset. You're holding to a purpose, yet seemingly attaching no importance to it. You carry on with the same intent, regardless of whether you're successful in your purpose or not. If experiences and qualities happen to arise that you like, that you want, well, you can savor them, appreciate them, but don't grasp after them, don't go chasing them. And if experiences arise that you don't like, such as fogginess or agitation or craving for something else to do, then you just let them be. Don't push them away, don't reject them. So mindfulness is like playing a game. Imagine you're playing a game with your kids, say Monopoly or something like that. Any game has a goal, which is to win the game, but at the same time, it's not really about winning or losing. That's not the point when you're playing with your kids. but you still go through the motions as though you were. Mindfulness is like that. It's not really about success or failure. What matters is the traveling, not the arriving, not the destination that you're trying to reach. And yet, it would be a mistake to lose sight of the purpose. I suspect this is a mistake a lot of people can make. In mindfulness, you're still applying the mind. You're deliberately paying attention. You're not just daydreaming. Mindfulness is often said to be non-judgmental. This comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's the main figure responsible for establishing mindfulness within a Western secular context. But there's actually a sense in which mindfulness is judgmental, or at least subtly judgmental. And that sense is that we need to judge whether our current experience, what we're paying attention to, is consistent with our underlying purpose. Mindfulness is not about just completely letting go. It's about balancing effort or application, or even will, with letting go or even abandon. That's why I choose to say that mindfulness is non-reactive rather than non-judgmental. So how do we make sense of this apparent paradox of having a purpose and yet not quite? Well, part of the answer is to appreciate that the purpose is different from the intent. The intent is immediate, but the purpose is rather longer term. It might be useful here just to go back to the dual intelligence model that we introduced in part 3 of module 1. It looks at the mind in terms of two parts, thinking intelligence and body intelligence. The thinking intelligence is more associated with conscious will and intent, while the other part is automatic and spontaneous. So maybe part of the resolution is that you as a conscious mind just concern yourself with the intent of stabilizing your focus, returning to the object of focus again and again. But the underlying purpose of developing qualities such as clarity and energy, you have to leave to that deeper part of the mind. You allow this other part of yourself to bring forth those qualities. So just to summarize, this is the mindfulness mindset. It's paying attention non-reactively, neither grasping nor rejecting, but trusting that qualities will emerge. So much is the traditional view of mindfulness, but there's more to be said about the nature of the focus, and so we come to the dimensions of attention. And the first one that I'd like to look at is broad versus narrow attention. So the idea is that if attention were like a camera lens, then this dimension is like the zoom. In broad attention, you're zoomed out so that you don't get the detail, but you do get the big picture. And in narrow attention, it's the other way around. It's probably easiest to understand in visual terms. Your eyes have quite a large visual field, but we don't usually pay attention to the whole of it. Attention is like a spotlight that only illuminates a small part of that whole field. So narrow attention is like a tightly focused spotlight, while broad attention is much more like a diffused light that illuminates much more of the visual field. The visual sense is one sensory channel, but the distinction applies to other senses too. It's about foreground and background. In narrow attention, the foreground is sharply defined, while in broad attention, the foreground merges into the background. So in terms of the auditory sense, when you listen to a sound, then it's in the foreground, so to speak, but there'll also be sounds in the background that you just don't attend to and that normally don't make it into your awareness, like, for example, traffic going past in the street outside, or maybe music. Again, normally we spend our time in narrow mode, listening only to the person we're in conversation with, or to the radio or television. The kinesthetic sense is the body sense, or a set of senses actually. Touch or pressure, also temperature and spatial location. With this sense too, we can zoom in, for example to the nostrils as breathed air goes in and out, as you might do in a mindfulness of breathing practice. Or you can zoom out to take in the breath as a whole, or even the body as a whole unity. So the point is that the style of attention, whether broad or narrow, makes a difference. And it's a difference that we can make use of in terms of our project in this course. In other words, it can be relevant to solving problems and achieving goals. What's the value in making the distinction between broad and narrow? I think the answer takes us back to the mind-body connection, which we've touched on a few times already. It's just the idea that how you think, feel and act is reflected in your body's physiology and vice versa. It applies to any state of mind, including attentional states. So that would suggest that broad attention is reflected in a different physiology to narrow attention. Now, I think most people would be prepared to accept that there'd be some difference in brain state between the two, but I think it goes beyond that. I think the body itself tends to be different. So what is the difference? Well, I'm hoping that the last exercise might have given you some clues. Let's think about broad and narrow attention in a wider context. I think chances are you'll spend quite a bit of time in narrow mode. For a lot of people, their work seems to involve paying close, narrow attention. Suppose you're an accountant. Suppose you want to make sure that your accounts records all tally up and match with your bank statements. You can imagine that takes close attention. Or imagine a surgeon making some fine incisions or stitches. Again, that would require narrow attention. Now imagine that you were watching a video of that accountant doing that kind of work, or that surgeon. What would they look like? What would their body posture be? What would their facial expression be? Or imagine watching a video of yourself doing something similar, doing one of your own examples. What would you look like? Now, if you think that maybe you'd be hunched up, maybe with a knotted brow or a clenched jaw, I think you'd be in good company. I think this is how most people would be. So narrow attention seems to typically involve tightness. It involves muscles being scrunched up, maybe the posture being tight and closed in and tension in the face. Conversely, broad attention seems to be the opposite. It goes with looseness. Maybe you can find this in your own examples. One of my own best examples of broad attention is when I go out for a walk in the countryside, especially if there are big vistas to be had, maybe open blue skies. When you take in a broad vista, you have to go into broad attention. So when I'm out walking, by the end of the day, I tend to feel like I'm opened up. I feel loose, my mind feels steadier, calmer, less likely to flit around. And I feel like this is reflected in less tension. For example, my facial expression would feel softer and looser. Now, I don't want to imply that broad attention is good while narrow attention is bad, or even that loose is good while tight is bad. It's not as simple as that. There are times when it's appropriate to be in narrow attention, and if you are, then you might well be tight, at least to a degree. The point is that to an extent the tight physiology supports or facilitates the narrow attention. So you can probably focus narrowly more effectively if you tighten up. That's why we do it. That's why we do it automatically without thinking about it. But I would say that if you get stuck in narrow attention all the time, or if you spend so much time in narrow attention that it becomes habitual, then you've got something of a problem. Have you ever spent a day being busy and working hard and then found that at the end of it you just can't switch off? I think that experience is pretty common. I know I've had it. I think that it happens in part because the physiology gets stuck in some sense. It becomes a sort of habit and you lose the flexibility. Okay, to summarize, attentional states, like other states of mind, are reflected in physiological states. And it's because in some sense the physiology supports or facilitates the function of the attentional state. And I think this idea has important ramifications. To explore how the idea of broad versus narrow attention is going to be useful, let's go back to the idea that mindfulness practice has a purpose. You want to develop qualities like stillness, calmness, clarity and focus, peace and contentment, positive emotion, etc. And you want to let go of or avoid negative qualities like agitation, restlessness, fogginess and confusion, cravings, negative emotions, etc. Even if the tactic is to be non-reactive either way, this is the underlying purpose of mindfulness practice. So the mind-body connection would suggest that there are certain physiological conditions or body states that would favour the arising of these positive qualities, and certain other sets of conditions that make the arising of these negative qualities more likely. So if you can accept that, and if we know what the relevant physiological parameters are, then surely a reasonable strategy would be to try to create the favourable physiological conditions. That, in short, is the basis for using biofeedback and mindfulness as tools together in a way that they mutually support each other. We'll come back to this point in part 3 of this module. For now, I want to come back to the idea that how you pay attention influences your physiology. So what we've got here is a tool. Cultivating broad attention is a means of indirectly shifting physiology, for example towards loose muscles, and perhaps in a direction that supports mindfulness or qualities such as clarity and contentment. And what exactly is the physiology that supports mindfulness? Well, we'll start to explore this question in the later modules of the course, but for now let's summarize it as a combination of calm, restful body states with an alert, activated brain.